Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something pretty profound, a way of looking at sin not as a crime that needs punishment, but as a disease that needs a cure. So let's get right to it. We're going to tackle one of those massive, age-old questions. If God is good, why is there so much evil and suffering? And to do that, we're going to explore the Orthodox Christian view of evil, and it all starts with making a really, really important distinction. All right, so the first step in this whole diagnosis is getting one thing straight. Not everything we call evil is actually the same thing. So this framework splits evil into two big categories. On one hand, you've got what we'd call physical misfortunes, things like floods, earthquakes, natural disasters. The source material has a great analogy for this. It's like the shadows in a painting. They're just part of the picture, not morally good or bad. But then, on the other hand, you have moral evil. This is what we call sin. And this is seen as the real problem, because it comes from a willful choice to turn away from God. And that leads to a really crucial point here. According to this view, God didn't create evil. Evil isn't its own thing. It doesn't have any substance. It's more like a corruption, a parasite that latches onto the good that God created. Think of it like rust on a perfectly good piece of metal, or a sickness in a healthy body. It's not a thing in itself. It's a turning away from how things were supposed to be. So, okay, where did this deviation, this corruption even begin? Well, the story doesn't actually start with us, with humanity. It starts in the spiritual world, with the angels. And if you look at the scriptures, they point to a single starting point for sin, a being we call the devil, which literally means the slanderer. But what's key here is that this being wasn't created evil. It was a good, created being that fell. And here's how that fall happened, step by step. It all started with one of the highest angels. He was created with free will, right? The incredible capacity to choose good. But instead, he chose pride. And that one choice, that pride, it sparked a rebellion. He fell away from his true purpose and became this source of temptation, actively working against everything good. Okay, so you have this rebellion in the spiritual realm. The big question is, how did that corruption make the jump into the human story? Well, the fall was even possible because we, humanity, were created with these incredible gifts, things like freedom, reason, and the ability to love. But here's the catch. Those very gifts are what create the potential to go wrong. Freedom to choose good also means freedom to disobey. Reason can lead to pride, and even love, when it's twisted, can turn from love of God into just love of self. And the temptation itself, it started in almost the exact same way it did with the angels, by challenging God's goodness. The tempter, taking the form of a serpent, doesn't come in with some big demand. No, it starts with a simple, subtle, and honestly a pretty sneaky question. It's designed to do one thing: plant a tiny seed of doubt. Now, Eve's initial response is fascinating because it shows she knows exactly what the deal is. She repeats the rule, she knows the consequence, there's zero confusion, the choice is crystal clear. But then the tempter hits back with a straight-up lie, but it's wrapped in this incredibly tempting promise. First, he denies the consequence. You won't die. And then he dangles this amazing prize. You'll be like gods. You see that? It's an appeal to the very same pride that caused the angels to fall in the first place. And that one choice, that single act of disobedience, it had absolutely catastrophic consequences. And not just for Adam and Eve, but for the entire human condition, for all of us that came after. This is such a key point to get. The fall wasn't just a one-off mistake that got put on a record. No, that single act introduced a brand new principle, what the Apostle Paul later calls a law of sin, right into the core operating system of humanity. It corrupted our very nature from the inside out. And if you've ever wondered what that inner corruption feels like, well, the Apostle Paul describes it perfectly. He calls it an internal civil war. You know that feeling? A part of you genuinely wants to do the right thing, to do good. But there's this other force, this other law that's constantly pulling you in the opposite direction, towards selfishness. It creates this constant state of inner conflict. And this internal, spiritual sickness, it didn't stay internal. It started to manifest on the outside too. The logic is pretty straightforward. If you separate yourself from God, who is the source of all life, what happens? Decay. the physical world starts to break down. And this is where things like disease, hard labor, and physical death itself enter the human story. But here's where this perspective really flips the script. It reframes all those terrible consequences in a really surprising way. Even suffering and death, they're seen as a kind of harsh medicine from a loving doctor. St. Cyril of Alexandria uses this great word, a bridle. It's like a painful but necessary measure to slow down the out-of-control growth of sin, to stop us from being totally consumed by it. Which brings us right to the heart of the diagnosis. It's a term you've probably heard a million times, but it's understood in a very, very different way here. And that term is original sin. Okay, if you take one thing away, let it be this. This definition is the absolute key. The Orthodox view is not that we inherit the legal guilt for Adam's crime. It's not like we're born legally responsible for something someone else did. No, what we inherit are the consequences. We inherit a spiritual disease, a kind of contagion that messes with our nature and gives every single one of us this deep-seated tendency towards sin. Hey, this is not some new idea they just came up with. This quote from an ancient council in Carthage makes a fascinating point. It basically says, look at our ancient practice of baptizing babies. An infant hasn't done anything wrong, right? They haven't committed any personal sins. So what's being cleansed? Well, it has to be this inherited condition, this spiritual sickness that gets passed down from one generation to the next. This chart here just lays it all out so clearly. Look at that first row. The Orthodox view says we inherit a spiritual disease. Compare that to the traditional Western views, both Catholic and Protestant, which historically emphasized inheriting legal guilt. Then look at the next row, the effect on our nature. In the Orthodox view, our nature is wounded. It's corrupted, for sure, but it's not totally destroyed. We still have free will and the image of God. That's a subtle difference, but it has absolutely massive implications for how you diagnose the human condition. And you see, that diagnosis, it changes everything. Because if sin isn't mainly a legal problem that needs a pardon, but instead it's a deep-seated illness that needs a physician, well, that reframes the entire story of salvation. It takes us out of the courtroom and puts us squarely into the hospital. And it leaves us with the most important question of all. If sin is a disease, then what is the cure?